Everyone remembers the boy who could barely hold a wand. Almost no one asks why the Sorting Hat placed him in Gryffindor without a second of hesitation. May 2nd, 1998. The courtyard of Hogwarts is on fire. Voldemort stands before a crowd of survivors, Harry Potter's body limp in Hagrid's arms. And from the broken ranks of students steps forward a boy with a bruised face, a torn cardigan, and the Sorting Hat in his hands. What happens next takes less than 4 seconds. But those 4 seconds end a war. To understand Neville Longbottom, you have to go back to the year he almost was not a wizard at all. His family genuinely feared he was a squib. His Uncle Algy once dangled him from an upstairs window and accidentally dropped him. Neville bounced off the garden and into the road. The family celebrated. That is the first time anyone recorded his magic manifesting. He was 8 years old. In most pureblood households, accidental magic appears before the age of 4. The internal registers of the Hogwarts quill, the enchanted instrument that records every magical birth in Britain, had marked Neville's name the moment he was born, yet his power stayed dormant so long that Augusta Longbottom reportedly wrote to the school asking whether the entry could have been a clerical error. The official explanation was always a late bloomer. But there is a deeper context. Neville's parents, Frank and Alice, were tortured into permanent insanity by Bellatrix Lestrange when he was barely a year old. The boy grew up visiting them at St. Mungo's, receiving empty candy wrappers from a mother who no longer recognized him. Magical trauma research, a field the ministry has never been eager to publicize, suggests that children exposed to extreme dark magic residue in infancy can experience suppressed magical development. Not because they lack power, but because their magic turns inward, building walls instead of sparks. In alchemical tradition, this phenomenon has a name: the sealed furnace, a vessel that appears cold and inert, but inside which pressure builds silently, invisibly, until the seal finally breaks. Medieval alchemists considered the sealed furnace the most dangerous stage of the great work, not because it fails, but because when it opens, nothing can contain what comes out. Consider the prophecy: born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. It applied to 2 boys. Voldemort chose Harry, but the prophecy never said the other boy was lesser. It simply said Voldemort would mark one of them. What the Dark Lord never understood, what perhaps even Dumbledore could not fully predict, is that the boy he did not choose would mark himself. Not through a scar, but through 7 years of quiet, stubborn, almost invisible courage. When Neville led Dumbledore's army during his 7th year at Hogwarts, he was beaten, cursed, and locked in punishment by the Carrows. He did not stop. When Voldemort set the Sorting Hat ablaze on his head, Neville did not scream. He reached inside and pulled out the Sword of Gryffindor, a relic that appears only for a true Gryffindor in a moment of exceptional need. And then he killed Nagini. But here is what almost no one thinks about. Nagini was not merely a snake. She was the final Horcrux, a container for a fragment of the most dangerous soul in wizarding history. The Sword of Gryffindor could destroy it only because it was impregnated with basilisk venom, one of the very few substances capable of damaging a soul anchor beyond repair. Neville did not know any of this. He did not know what a Horcrux was. He did not know the sword would come. He simply stood up when no one else could, and the universe answered. Slughorn once noted in a faculty report that Longbottom's potion work was catastrophically below standard. That same student grew up to become professor of herbology at Hogwarts, a position that requires not only mastery of magical botany, but a deep, patient understanding of how living things grow under impossible conditions. There is an irony there so precise it almost sounds deliberate. Neville Longbottom was never the chosen one. He was something the prophecy never accounted for, the one who chose himself. But raw courage is one thing. Refined skill is another, and sometimes the most dangerous wizard in a room is the smallest one standing on a stack of books. Phileas Flitwick won the All-England Dueling Championship, and then chose to spend the rest of his life teaching 11-year-olds how to make feathers float. Picture the Great Hall, 1958. A wizard barely 3.5 feet tall steps onto the dueling platform at the British Invitational. His opponent, Everard Whitmore, 6'2", two-time Continental finalist, does not bother to bow properly. 14 seconds later, Whitmore is flat on his back, wand spinning across the floor, and the hall is so silent you can hear the candles drip. Flitwick adjusts his waistcoat, steps down, and asks if anyone has seen where the tea service has gone. What most people forget is that dueling at the championship level in the 1950s was not the theatrical nonsense Lockhart later tried to revive. The International Dueling Federation maintained a registered combat index for every licensed competitor, and according to records kept by the British Wizarding Sports Authority, Flitwick held the highest precision rating in charm-based combat for 11 consecutive years. He never lost a sanctioned match. Not once. He retired undefeated, not because he ran out of challengers, but because he accepted the Hogwarts teaching post and simply stopped entering. His goblin heritage mattered more than polite wizarding society liked to admit. Goblin magic operates on fundamentally different principles. It prioritizes intent over incantation, willpower over wand movement. Flitwick inherited just enough of that lineage to process spell work faster than almost any pure wizard could. In real-world fencing, this would be called tempo, the ability to act inside your opponent's decision cycle. Flitwick did not outpower his rivals. He outthought them before their wands finished moving. The Ministry's Auror office quietly approached him 3 times between 1960 and 1975, offering a senior combat instructor position. He declined every time. An internal memorandum from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, referenced in a 1971 staffing review, noted with visible frustration that Professor Flitwick remains committed to Hogwarts despite skills that significantly exceed his current professional application. They genuinely could not understand why the most precise combat caster in Britain wanted to teach cheering charms to 3rd years. Dumbledore understood. He had seen the same pattern in himself. The wizard whose greatest strength is knowing exactly where his power belongs. During the Battle of Hogwarts, Flitwick dueled Antonin Dolohov and multiple Death Eaters simultaneously, casting defensive enchantments across entire corridors while maintaining shield charms over fleeing students. Minerva McGonagall later said she had never seen anyone cast that many spells at once without a single one failing. But here is the part nobody talks about. After the battle, when every surviving fighter was being celebrated, Flitwick went back to his classroom. He repaired the desks. He reshelved the books. He put the practice cushions back in order. And when students returned the following September, he stood on his usual stack of books and said, in his usual cheerful squeak, "Welcome to Charms." No speech about what he had done. No war stories. The most dangerous duelist Hogwarts had ever employed simply went back to teaching, because for Flitwick the feathers were never beneath him. They were the entire point. Some wizards prove their power by what they destroy. Others prove it by what they quietly choose to protect. And sometimes that protection wears an Auror's badge and reshapes an entire government. Kingsley Shacklebolt never raised his voice. In 40 years of service, as an Auror, as a spy, as a war commander, and finally as Minister for Magic, almost no one can recall a single moment when he shouted. And that silence was more dangerous than most wizards' loudest spells. Picture the Ministry atrium, summer of 1996. The marble floors still carry scorch marks from the duel between Dumbledore and Voldemort just weeks earlier. Maintenance wizards are quietly repairing the Fountain of Magical Brethren. And Kingsley Shacklebolt walks through it all with his calm, measured stride, gold earring catching the torchlight, heading to a briefing on the hunt for Sirius Black, a man he has been secretly protecting for over a year. The Auror Office's internal evaluation records from 1994 described Shacklebolt's assignment to the Sirius Black case as a stroke of luck for the Ministry, their best field operative on their most wanted fugitive. What they did not know was that Dumbledore had specifically requested this arrangement through channels so quiet they have never been fully traced. Kingsley fed the Ministry false leads pointing toward Tibet. For over 12 months, the entire international pursuit of Sirius Black was, in effect, a fiction, authored by one man filling out the right reports with the wrong coordinates. Consider what that required. Not raw dueling power, though Kingsley had plenty of that. It required a mind that could sustain a double life under the scrutiny of the most paranoid law enforcement body in wizarding Britain. The Auror office employed passive legitimacy screening on its own operatives during that period, a practice inherited from the First War that was never officially acknowledged. Shacklebolt passed everyone. There is a real-world parallel worth noting. Intelligence historians call it the principle of the trusted insider, the idea that the most effective agent is never the one who hides in corners, but the one who stands so visibly in the center of the institution that suspicion flows around him like water around stone. Kingsley understood this instinctively. He did not avoid attention, he commanded it, and in commanding it became invisible in the one way that mattered. When Voldemort's forces seized the Ministry in August of 1997, Kingsley was one of the few Order members who had prepared contingency networks in advance. His Patronus, a lynx, notably one of the few solitary predators in the animal kingdom, reached the burrow in time to save over 30 lives at Bill and Fleur's wedding. The official Death Eater report on the raid noted, with visible frustration, that someone had warned them. They never identified who. After the Battle of Hogwarts, the surviving Wizengamot appointed Kingsley as interim minister within 72 hours. He was confirmed permanently within the year. His first act was not a grand declaration. It was the quiet dissolution of the Muggle-born Registration Commission and the destruction of every record it had created. No speeches. No tribunals for public satisfaction. Just the machinery of persecution, dismantled before it could leave a template for the next generation to rebuild. But here is the detail that reveals the man more than any battlefield ever could. During his time embedded as a secretary to the Muggle Prime Minister, a role that required him to function convincingly in an entirely non-magical government, Kingsley reportedly earned a commendation for efficiency. The Prime Minister tried to promote him twice, a wizard of extraordinary power, pretending to be ordinary, and doing it so well that ordinary people wanted to give him more responsibility. That is not just discipline, that is a kind of profound respect for the world he was protecting. Kingsley Shacklebolt never needed the world to know what he had done. He needed the world to survive long enough to forget it. And yet, for every quiet protector who reshapes a government through patience, there is a brilliant mind that reshapes everything through deception. A young man with 12 outstanding Aubaeuels, a father who worshipped the law, and a talent so sharp it fooled Albus Dumbledore himself for an entire year. 12 outstanding Aubaeuels, the same number Albus Dumbledore himself once earned. Barty Crouch Jr. sat his examinations in the summer of 1981. 12 subjects, 12 outstandings, not a single paper required a second glance. The same quill that aced his charms theory would later forge Alastor Moody's handwriting for a year without a single slip. What most people remember is the trial, the screaming boy dragged before the Wizengamot, begging his father for mercy. What most people forget is the intelligence required to reach that courtroom. The Longbottom attack was not mindless cruelty. It was a sustained interrogation using the Cruciatus Curse with such precision that 3 adult Aurors could not breach the protective enchantments Crouch had cast around the room. He was 19. Ministry sentencing records from 1982 classify him as fanatical follower. This is the same ministry that failed to notice he had escaped Azkaban, failed to notice he was living under an invisibility cloak in his father's house, and failed to notice he had replaced one of the most recognizable Aurors in Britain. The word follower did remarkable heavy lifting in that file. Now consider what his impersonation actually demanded. Polyjuice Potion sustains appearance, not knowledge. Crouch had to master Moody's combat instincts, his teaching method, his personal history with dozens of colleagues, his paranoid habits, and perform it all under the daily gaze of Albus Dumbledore. In espionage, they call this the legend, a cover identity so thorough that even intimates accept the inconsistencies. Crouch held his legend for 10 months inside the most magically surveilled building in Britain. And this is where the story becomes truly unsettling. He was an excellent defense against the dark arts teacher. Neville Longbottom, the son of the people Crouch had tortured into permanent insanity, flourished in his classroom. He did not stumble through the role. He excelled. Which raises a question no one ever answers. Was Barty Crouch Jr. a genius who chose darkness, or a broken boy who never saw a single adult prove that brilliance could serve anything other than power? His father gave him the law. Voldemort gave him purpose. Nobody gave him anything that resembled love. But the cruelest truth of Barty Crouch Jr. is not what he did to others. It is what he proved about himself. A man capable of a flawless disguise for a year, of teaching children with genuine skill, of earning the highest marks Hogwarts could offer, spent every grain of that talent ensuring the return of someone who would never once remember his name. And if one shattered genius could rattle Hogwarts through deception and discipline alone, imagine what happens when that same ferocity runs through someone who never once hid. Someone who walked into battle with her face uncovered and her family's madness burning like a crown. She never wore a mask. Every other Death Eater at the Department of Mysteries hid behind silver and bone. Bellatrix Lestrange walked in with her eyes wide open and her wand already singing. The night the Longbottoms fell, neighbors in Upper Flagley reported hearing laughter through stone walls for nearly 40 minutes. Not screaming, laughter. When the Auror team finally breached the wards, they found Frank Longbottom still gripping his wand, though he could no longer remember what it was for. Her Hogwarts record tells a story the films never touched. Bellatrix Black earned outstanding marks in defense against the dark arts, charms, and potions by her 4th year, a combination that placed her, according to an internal review by the Department of Magical Education, among the top 15 students of the decade. Slughorn, who collected talented pupils the way other men collected rare vintages, never once invited her to the Slug Club. When asked why years later, he said only, "Some talent you display, some you lock away and hope no one notices." What makes Bellatrix uniquely terrifying is not her cruelty. Cruelty was common enough in those ranks. It is that she was genuinely gifted. The Cruciatus Curse requires sustained emotional commitment to function at full power. Most wizards can hold it for seconds before their concentration fractures. Ministry interrogation records from the first war list Bellatrix as maintaining it for extraordinary durations without measurable loss of intensity. The Auror Office classified her not as a dark witch, but as a persistent magical threat, the same designation reserved for cursed locations and uncontained magical creatures. Medieval scholars documented what they called fervor inversus, inverted devotion, where a person's full capacity for faith and sacrifice turns toward destruction while retaining every outward quality of genuine belief. Bellatrix loved Voldemort. That is not metaphor. She loved him with the same architecture of emotion that others use to love their children. The machinery was identical. Only the object was monstrous. This is what separated her from Lucius Malfoy, who served out of ambition and retreated out of fear. Bellatrix never retreated. After 14 years in Azkaban, surrounded by Dementors that feed on happiness, she emerged and dueled Aurors that same evening. What does that tell you about a woman whose happiness was indistinguishable from violence? Her duel with Molly Weasley is often remembered as a surprise. It should not be. Bellatrix was the superior technical duelist, but she was laughing. She was always laughing. And Molly Weasley was not dueling with technique. She was dueling with something Bellatrix had never once accounted for in her entire life: the undiluted fury of someone fighting for love rather than from it. And this is where the real weight of her story settles. She had every gift that greatness requires: intellect, power, discipline, conviction, and she poured all of it into a man who could not love her back. Not because he chose not to, because he was incapable. Voldemort's greatest weapon was a woman who gave him everything, and whose tragedy is that she never once understood she received nothing in return. But raw power surrendered to darkness is only half the equation, because sometimes equal power chooses a different allegiance entirely, and the quiet stubbornness of that choice holds a castle together through 2 wars. A choice, not between good and evil, between 2 perfectly reasonable futures, one of which would have made her powerful, and the other of which made her permanent. In the autumn of 1956, a young Scottish witch sat in a rented flat in London, staring at 2 letters on a kitchen table that still smelled of cheap paint. One bore the Ministry seal, a promotion to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, 2 years ahead of schedule. The other bore the Hogwarts crest, written in Dumbledore's unmistakable violet ink. She had been at the Ministry for barely 2 years. She was already miserable. What most people forget is that Minerva McGonagall did not simply leave the Ministry. She fled a life she recognized. Her mother, Isabel Ross, had been one of the most gifted witches of her generation, and had spent decades concealing her magic, shrinking herself to fit the shape of her husband's world. Minerva had watched that erosion from childhood. She had already turned down a marriage proposal from a Muggle man she loved, Dougal McGregor, because she understood the arithmetic. To stay was to repeat. The Ministry offered a different cage, but the architecture was familiar. Ambition measured in titles, talent spent on politics. Her personnel file at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement contained a note from her supervisor that read, in part, "Exceptional capability, unsuited to institutional patience." They meant it as a criticism. She took it as a diagnosis. Medieval Oxford had a phrase for scholars who refused royal appointments to remain at the university. They were called those who preferred the cloister to the crown. McGonagall's choice carried the same weight. She did not reject the Ministry because she lacked ambition. She rejected it because she recognized the difference between influence and purpose. Dumbledore, notably, never pressured her. He simply offered the position and waited. He understood the decision better than anyone. He had made it himself decades earlier for reasons far more painful. 2 people who could have reshaped the Ministry chose instead to shape children. The Ministry never quite forgave either of them for it. And here is what rarely gets said. McGonagall did not defend Hogwarts in 2 wars because she was brave. She defended it because she had decided, 40 years before the First War began, that this was the place worth dying for. Courage is easy to admire. Commitment of that duration is harder to name. She turned down the world and chose a castle. And when the world came for the castle, it found her standing in the doorway. But commitment to a place is one thing, and the next name on this list chose something far stranger. He committed to a dead woman's memory and weaponized his own bitterness into a kind of loyalty no one recognized until it was far too late. Most wizards never invent a single spell in their entire lives. Severus Snape was doing it between homework assignments. Sometime around 1975, in a dormitory beneath the Black Lake, a 16-year-old half-blood sat cross-legged on his bed with a second-hand copy of Advanced Potion Making open across his knees. The margins were already dense with his handwriting, crossed-out incantations, revised instructions, arrows pointing to better methods. The castle was quiet. Everyone else was at dinner. What Snape was doing in those margins was not studying. It was original magical research, the kind that adult wizards with ministry grants and decades of experience struggle to produce. Levicorpus, Muffliato, Langlock, Sectum Sempra. Each one a functioning, repeatable spell with a stable incantation, a consistent wand movement, and a predictable effect. The Department of Magical Education's own census has recorded that fewer than 1 in 400 witches or wizards ever successfully creates a novel charm in their lifetime. Snape created at least 4 before he could legally apparate. Medieval alchemists called this phenomenon the marginal mind, the observation that some of history's most dangerous innovations were not written in grand treatises, but scribbled in the blank spaces of other people's books. Roger Bacon, Paracelsus, even Flamel's earliest transmutation notes were margin work. Snape fits that tradition exactly. He was not trying to publish. He was not trying to impress. He was simply thinking faster than the curriculum could contain. And the official version of Severus Snape at Hogwarts? A greasy, unsociable Slytherin who was adequate at potions and unfortunate in his friendships. Slughorn remembered him as talented but unpleasant. Most teachers barely remembered him at all. No award, no special recognition. The boy who was quietly rewriting the boundaries of offensive magic went entirely unnoticed, because brilliance without social currency is invisible at every school, magical or otherwise. Here is what no one discusses. Sectum Sempra was not a dueling spell. Its effects, deep, cursed lacerations that resist healing, are consistent with dark combat magic designed to kill. A teenager wrote that. A teenager who was being regularly humiliated, who was watching the girl he loved drift towards someone else, who was being recruited by a rising Dark Lord. That spell was not academic. It was personal. And the fact that he later chose restraint, never once using it during the years he walked a razor edge as a double agent, tells you something about the distance between capability and character. But here is the part that cuts deepest. Snape never told anyone. He never cataloged his inventions, never sought a patent, never submitted a single finding to any journal. His entire body of original magical research survived only because he forgot to take his textbook home. And decades later, a boy with his mother's eyes opened it by accident. The next name on this list did not hide his brilliance. He displayed it, carefully, charmingly, strategically, and by the age of 16, he had already used it to commit murder. 16. That is the age at which Tom Marvolo Riddle committed his first known murder, framed a classmate for the crime, and received a trophy for it. June 1943. The second-floor girls' lavatory at Hogwarts. A basilisk, a 1,000-year-old serpent bred in darkness beneath the school, obeyed the voice of a 16-year-old boy who had spent months whispering to pipes in Parseltongue after curfew. Myrtle Warren died without understanding what she saw. Her body was found by the sinks, her eyes still open. What most people remember is the result. Hagrid was expelled, the attacks stopped, and Riddle earned a special award for services to the school. What most people do not think about is the architecture of the lie. Riddle did not simply point a finger at Hagrid. He waited. The Hogwarts Board of Governors had already voted to close the school. Headmaster Dippet was drafting farewell letters to parents. Riddle, an orphan with nowhere to go over summer, needed Hogwarts to stay open more than anyone alive. So he gave them exactly what they wanted: a culprit, a resolution, a reason to feel safe. The school rewarded him not for truth, but for comfort. The ministry's internal summary of the 1943 chamber incident runs 4 pages. 3 discuss Hagrid's acromantula. The 4th, almost as an afterthought, notes that Prefect T.M. Riddle demonstrated exemplary initiative during the crisis. No one investigated how a 5th year had located the chamber that Hogwarts staff had failed to find for 9 centuries. No one asked the simplest question: why did the attacks stop only after Riddle intervened, and not a moment before? Horace Slughorn later called him the most brilliant student he had ever taught. He meant it as pride. But consider the timeline. In the very same year Riddle opened the chamber, he sat in Slughorn's office and coaxed from him the secret of Horcruxes. Not one forbidden act. 2. The murder of Myrtle Warren was not an end. It was raw material. Her death became the anchor for Riddle's diary, his first Horcrux, the first of 6 deliberate fractures of his own soul. Criminal psychologists in the Muggle world have a term for this pattern: organized offending, a perpetrator who plans meticulously, who charms authority, who hides inside institutional trust. Riddle did not merely hide, he made the institution love him for it. But here is what makes this story not just disturbing, but essential. Only one person at Hogwarts was not comforted by the tidy ending. Only one teacher looked at the perfect prefect and felt something wrong. Not proof, not evidence, just the instinct of someone who recognized brilliance running too cold. Tom Riddle became the most dangerous wizard who ever lived, not because no one could see him, but because only one man did, and spent the next 50 years preparing for what that boy would become. That man is next on this list. Fear, the darkest wizard in history, a man who split his soul 7 times, was afraid of a schoolteacher. June 1945. A narrow valley outside a German village. No witnesses, no journalists. What the International Confederation later called the most extraordinary duel in modern history lasted 3 hours, shattered the walls of a 16th century chapel, and ended with Albus Dumbledore holding the Elder Wand, a weapon he never sought and would never use to conquer. In alchemical tradition, the magnum opus was never about creating gold. It was about transforming the self. Dumbledore, who worked alongside Nicholas Flamel and identified 12 uses of dragon's blood, understood something Flamel took 6 centuries to learn. The final stage of the great work is knowing when to stop. The Wizengamot offered him the position of Minister for Magic 3 times. Internal memoranda from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement revealed that the 3rd offer in 1957 was not a request. It was a unanimous appointment, already drafted and signed by the full council. Dumbledore returned the document with one line: "I am better suited to a classroom than a throne." The filing clerk noted in the margin, "He is the only one who believes this." The ministry preferred to frame him as an eccentric headmaster fond of lemon drops. That was convenient. Because the honest picture, a wizard who held the death stick and had broken Grindelwald, choosing to teach 11-year-olds how to transfigure matchsticks, was not comforting. It was unsettling. Voldemort craved power as a birthright. Dumbledore recognized it as a scar. 2 of the most gifted wizards in history looked at the same throne. One spent a lifetime climbing toward it. The other spent a lifetime building walls between himself and it. Elphias Doge admitted in a private letter that he saw Dumbledore weep exactly once, not at Ariana's funeral, not after defeating Grindelwald, but on an ordinary evening in 1971, sitting alone in his office, holding a letter from Nurmengard. Doge never learned what it said. And if Dumbledore was the only wizard Voldemort feared, what does it mean that the thing Dumbledore feared most wasn't Voldemort, but a mirror? The mirror of Erist showed him his family whole and alive. He told a 12-year-old boy it showed him holding socks. That gentle lie reveals more than any duel ever could. He carried grief so private that when magic itself laid his heart bare, he answered with a joke, because some wounds are simply not for sharing. But here is what makes his place on this list so telling. He is not ranked for the power he wielded. He is ranked for the power he refused. The rarest wizard is not the one who can take everything. It is the one who can and does not. And yet one name on this list predates them all. A Slytherin graduate whose legacy shaped the magical world for a millennium, and whom history has been quietly misremembering ever since. Slytherin. Not the House of Evil, the house that produced the most famous wizard who ever lived, and then spent 1,000 years pretending it did not matter. Merlin walked the corridors of Hogwarts when the founders themselves still taught there. Picture it. A castle not yet ancient, its stones still pale, its enchantments still being written into the walls, and a young man in green-trimmed robes learning magic from Salazar Slytherin himself. What the chocolate frog cards will tell you is simple. Merlin, medieval, The most famous wizard of all time, what they do not tell you is the contradiction at the center of his legacy. Merlin was sorted into Slytherin, the house that would become synonymous with pureblood supremacy. And he became the most celebrated advocate for Muggle rights the wizarding world has ever known. He founded the Order of Merlin not as a medal, but as an organization dedicated to preventing wizards from using magic against the non-magical population. The award that bears his name today is a diluted echo of something far more radical. Early ministry records from the 13th century refer to the order not as an honor, but as a movement, one that directly opposed the growing sentiment that magical blood granted authority over those without it. Merlin did not simply disagree with Muggle persecution. He built an institution to fight it. And he did this as a Slytherin, centuries before the house's reputation calcified into something he would not have recognized. Here is the real-world parallel that makes this richer. The historical Merlin of Arthurian legend was an advisor to kings, a figure who stood between power and those it would consume. In the wizarding world, Rowling placed him in the one house defined by ambition, and made his ambition the protection of the powerless. That is not an accident. That is a thesis. Consider what Slytherin House lost when it forgot him. Every generation of students sorted under the green banner inherited the legacy of Salazar's prejudice and quietly buried the legacy of his greatest pupil. Slughorn never hung Merlin's portrait in his office. No Slytherin prefect cited him in a common room speech. The house remembered the founder who left. It forgot the student who stayed and changed everything. And this is where the real weight of his story lands. He did not rebel against Slytherin House. He fulfilled its highest promise. That ambition, untethered from cruelty, can reshape the world. Every Order of Merlin First Class ever awarded is proof that a Slytherin's dream outlasted a Slytherin's hatred. The world did not forget Merlin. It forgot what he stood for. And that might be the most dangerous kind of forgetting there is. And those were the 10 most powerful Hogwarts graduates. But power, as we have seen, is never just a question of what a wand can do. You know what genuinely surprises me about all of this? Not one person on this list became powerful in front of an audience. Not really. We remember the battles, the duels, the dramatic revelations. But every single one of these 10 was shaped by something that happened when no one was watching. A boy standing alone in a room deciding he was enough. A professor choosing a castle over a career, and never once explaining why. A young man staring into a mirror and deciding to fracture his own soul. The most powerful Hogwarts graduates did not become what they were in the Great Hall or on a battlefield. They became it in empty corridors, in private grief, in moments so small that history never bothered to record them. And that is what unsettles me most. Not that power is rare, but that the moments which create it are invisible. We celebrate what these people did. We have almost no idea when they decided to do it. So here is what I want to leave you with. If you could witness one moment from this list, not a duel, not a battle, but the quiet, private instant where one of these 10 became who they were, whose moment would you choose? Tell me in the comments. If you have made it this far, you already belong in this classroom. Subscribing simply makes it official. The next lesson concerns something most fans have seen on every single reread and never once questioned why it was there. I will see you when the candles are lit.